with this inquiry. We are on live broadcast, so anything you say, if a private conversation will get recorded. So refrain is the answer. But if you have to consult, please do feel free so. Before we start, it would be helpful if from my left, if you would introduce yourself and say who you are. If you want to say any more than that, you can. If you want to make a short statement, feel free to do so. And then we'll progress with the questions. So, please.
Good afternoon, my lords. I'm Michael Kaplan, QC. I'm a solicitor. I was a senior partner at Kingsley Napley, primarily dealing with criminal litigation for 30 years, and in the last couple of years I've remained as a consultant. I also sit as a recorder in the Crown Court.
And I'm Sarah Whitehouse, QC. I'm a barrister, and I'm currently Senior Treasury Counsel, and I'll explain what that means. As Criminal Treasury Counsel, I'm appointed by the Attorney General to prosecute high-profile or complex serious crimes such as murder and terrorism and fraud. There are 7 Senior Treasury Counsel in England and Wales, and the result of that is that although I remain an independent barrister, I defend as well as prosecute. Mostly, currently, I only have time to prosecute. Like Michael, I also sit as a recorder, a part-time judge in the Crown Court.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, my lords. My name is Paul Harris, and I'm the senior partner of Edward Fell, Bradshaw and Waterston Solicitors in London. I have been a police station and court duty solicitor since 1993. I'm a former president of the London Criminal Court Solicitors Association, and I sit on the Criminal Procedure Rule Committee as one of the 2 solicitor representatives.
Thank you very much. Do any of you want to make any statement at all? Okay, shall we progress with the questions then? So if I start off, it's actually, the question is about the level of understanding in the criminal justice system of the whole area of forensic science. So the question is, how good is that understanding about the veracity of forensic science? What is the communication system? How do lawyers, judges, etc. have communication about the evidence they presented with in forensic science has got any validity or not? And how can all this be improved?
Would you like to start?
Do you want me to
Whoever wants to
start,
go
as
first.
you say, my Lord Chairman? I think it's varied. There are obviously a number of people who are specialists and have a great deal of knowledge. But forensic science is a specialist activity and a specialist discipline. And I think one of the difficulties is those who approach it for the first time, which is often the juries, do need assistance. If you're, as practitioners, involved in a number of cases, you learn about forensic science. There are training courses. But if I had a criticism that I often make about this area, is that those who produce reports on various matters don't often take account of the fact that those who are reading the reports are not as experienced or knowledgeable as they are. And particularly when it comes to understanding what the outcomes are or what a forensic scientist is saying, is sometimes having to rewrite that or re-look at it in a way which it can be put and presented, for example, to a court and particularly to a jury. And certainly putting my hat on perhaps for a moment as a part-time judge, I do often find it necessary to say to those who are giving forensic evidence, do you really mean this? A summary would be this, so that is more understandable. So I think it is varied. There are training courses, but I think there are difficulties, and perhaps it is necessary to reduce what is being said in a way which can be understood by everyone. Those would be my remarks.
Okay.
In my experience, the levels of understanding generally among the judiciary and the bar are very good because they are adept at absorbing new scientific ideas and concepts quite quickly. Presentation is more difficult, but some of the difficulties that Michael has mentioned are remedied, in fact, in practice by the way in which the advocates present the evidence and challenge it before a jury. The bar trains its own advocates, both on training courses which happen 3 times a year in various centres, and also on an international advanced course in Oxford in the summer, which many attend. The difficulties, I think, though, are juries, because juries don't always understand that forensic science is not a magical golden key, and they must slot the scientific evidence they hear into the context of the other evidence in the case. Perhaps too often they watch too much American television and think that DNA will solve everything.
I think that the understanding of lawyers of expert evidence is patchy. Certainly many defence solicitors have to learn on the job. There are courses to go on and lectures, but there's no mandatory requirements, and often you are finding out about a particular expertise when you're first dealing with the evidence in relation to that expertise. And I also think that the defence position is different because they're reacting normally to the evidence that it's served and looking at its strengths, weaknesses and limitations and how it relates to the case against their client. And then they have to be able to explain it to their clients, some of whom who have vulnerability issues will struggle to understand its significance. And I think sometimes that's lost. And the defendant can become sort of outside the process when in fact they're the most important person in the process, because it is difficult to explain the expert evidence in a way that they will understand.
Okay. How often would a lawyer, whether it's a defense, prosecution or judiciary, come across cases where forensic science is used as one piece of evidence?
I'm sorry, my Lord Chairman, I didn't hear the end of the question. Where forensic science is used
as a piece of evidence?
All the time.
So it is commonly a lawyer would come across in any of this situation. And therefore, an education of lawyers, and I use the generic term, on a continuous basis for forensic science is an important part. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. And many lawyers, and I'm sure I speak for solicitors as well as barristers, take the opportunity to attend the seminars which are organised by many of the forensic science providers.
But they are not mandatory.
They're not mandatory. One possibility might be that a mandatory module is included as part of the bar professional training course,
right,
and the equivalent for solicitors, or that it's included as part of the compulsory training that takes place 3 years after call for barristers. I'm not sure about solicitors.
One of the issues is, of course, that the nature of scientific evidence improves and changes all of the time. So when I qualified 30 years ago, the scientific evidence that was in existence then is completely different to the evidence that is available now. So I do think that regular training and updates is key going forward. And also in relation to your first question about communication, if there was some kind of panel of experts, judiciary, lawyers for the prosecution and the defence, and the police as well, and all other relevant stakeholders, then that might be a way of keeping the professions up to date, addressing challenging issues, issuing regular bulletins and updates.
Who might do that?
I don't know who might do that. I've got the idea, but I can't say. But it may be a combination of different bodies could get together to put something like that together. For example, the Criminal Procedural Committee is made up of different stakeholders in the criminal justice system. Solicitors, barristers, prosecution, defence, all types of stakeholders. You could perhaps have a similar body to look at expert evidence, particularly as it's becoming more and more important and cropping up in most cases.
Lord Fox.
Well, really building on that actually is that certain sorts of forensic evidence are kind of digital. A substance is present or it's not present. An email was sent or it wasn't sent. Other forensic information evidence is probabilistic, so mixed DNA or partial fingerprints. Is that distinction clearly understood, and does the legal profession understand the difference and the nature of probabilities, and is that taken on in the process of a trial by both the defence and the prosecution?
Well, the Inns of Court College have just produced, with the Royal Statistical Society, a on that very topic, statistics and probability for advocates, which is the sort of innovation which the Inns of Court College has started and will build upon. Because the straight answer to your question is probably it's not well understood in all areas, but which is why it's been addressed in this. But every time any lawyer embarks upon a case, they will learn more about the developments in forensic evidence since they last encountered whatever area it is. So we are continuing to develop professionally, in fact, every time we encounter such evidence.
And that's true for defence as well, because perhaps they have less time and less resource at their...
I think there is certainly, from a defence point of view, inevitably a funding issue.
Yes.
And it's a real issue, there's no question about it, as to the time they are entitled to spend on the case for which they might be properly paid. And I think those perhaps who look at that don't understand that when you're looking at forensic evidence, it takes often a considerable time. Correct. Especially it may be new areas which are evolving all the time. And one can obviously look at them, and one example perhaps is facial mapping, which has been looked at in recent years. Yeah. But you've got to look at that, you've got to understand it, and it really is very much a living issue. And I think there are real difficulties, especially as it may well be a solicitor who acts for a defendant may not appreciate, will not know at the very beginning that he may have to encounter somewhere down the line this type of evidence.
Yeah, the timing of that evidence.
And when it comes through. And the other point, if I can just take up, I think what was mentioned before, certainly more and more there is forensic evidence available and being used or being looked at in cases. And I think one can see that from the point of view that you probably know we now have throughout all the Crown Courts. Virtually every case now is what we call a digital case, where it's on a case where you do have an index for that. It's all there digitally, and more there's evidence of a forensic nature in a particular department on that case. I'm sure my colleagues will agree with me there. So more and more it's evidence which is evolving, but we and our colleagues are individuals and need time obviously to master all these.
There are huge challenges with cases where the defendant is subject to a legal aid order, and most criminal cases are legally aided. In order to instruct an expert, you have to persuade the legal aid authority to authorise the expenditure, and then you have to find an expert who's prepared to do it at the rates that are available. So that is a huge challenge, and in fact arguably distinguishes, differentiates between a private paying client and what they have access to, and a legally aided client.
Okay. Lord Hunt.
So we've been touching on the differences between forensic science provision for the prosecution and the defence. I was wondering, because a lot of, we kept hearing about forensic science as an activity of scientists specialised in forensic issues. But there are many cases in which you need to bring in scientists, for example, who don't normally do this, because in order to I mean, I have this experience myself of being in the Jenkins case, and there were specialists dealing with the human body who were used, and particularly, I mean, there are, it seems to me, we haven't really heard this, and we have electronics, we have dynamics, we have medicine, all of these areas, and it's also part of this case is research being, the research being developed in these areas, is it being fed through, to to forensic cases, you know, in the way that it should be, or is it just up to the barrister to sort of try to find somebody somewhere to do that? Is there a systematic process in which all the different areas of knowledge can be brought to bear?
There's no systematic process that I know of, but lawyers on all sides, and may I say that the funding constraints are as difficult for the prosecution as they are for the defence. There is no difference. But my experience is that when a case arises, the parties to it on both sides will seek to find out whether or not there are developments in that area that might be of assistance in the more sort of arcane areas that aren't commonly encountered. But it may be that my colleagues would have more to say because they see it from the defence perspective.
I think what I would say is, if you look a decade ago, you didn't have the expertise in certain areas, perhaps that you have now. It's opened up. We all know examples, and we've all seen, for example, what's happened with DNA evidence in the years. So you've got that, and that will continue to evolve. And it never ceases to amaze me that often you can find an expert in fields you've never heard of until you've come to a case where the issue has arisen. But that feeds into a point which I think we've all made. We have had to learn the effect of that, the use of that evidence, how we might present that in court. And that's another area perhaps which people don't fully appreciate.
Thank you.
Please, Lord Griffiths and then Lord.
You said that you thought the resources available for the prosecution and defence were both constrained in some sense.
Yes.
Certainly the impression I've had, but if you asked me to give hard evidence exactly what it was, I couldn't. But it's certainly a strong impression that the resources for the prosecution have been greater than the resources for the defence.
I can't give hard evidence, and I can't give you what the numbers. All I can say is that the prosecution do not have unlimited resources, and when forensic testing is carried out in relation to a murder trial, for example, there are limited testing has to be done according to a very tightly focused investigation. That there aren't the resources simply to test every blood stain and every piece of DNA, and the resources of the barristers involved for the prosecution are exactly the same. In fact, as far as remuneration is concerned, prosecution barristers are paid rather less than defence barristers, as it happens.
Can I just add that I accept that there are huge limitations for the police and the prosecution in relation to seeking expert evidence, but I do think that it's a completely different challenge for the defence, who are reacting to the evidence that the prosecution have chosen to serve in a limited time usually, and then have to persuade another government agency effectively who aren't lawyers whether they will authorise the expense to look at that expert evidence. And additionally, the prosecution, the way I believe it's set up is they can bulk purchase from particular expertise or expert companies expert evidence and reports, whilst of course the defence have to find a one-off, a particular expert who will do it. Usually, in my experience, the legal aid agency want 3 different quotes, often finding 3 people who are prepared to do it for those sort of rates in any event is hard enough. And then they'll always go with the cheapest one. And I do think there are significant disadvantages to the defence in obtaining expert evidence which don't necessarily apply to the prosecution.
What happens if the defence is in prison already? Because in the case I was mentioning, it was a retrial, and I have no idea under what circumstances. I should imagine many people who have been convicted rather like a retrial and hope that it might.
Well, of course, if someone is in prison, that raises another difficulty which we as defence lawyers know of taking instructions and seeing them. But I know that's not an issue perhaps for the committee today. But if I can just emphasise what Paul has said, that, if I may say so, you shouldn't underestimate the fact that if you're defending someone and you think it's necessary to have a report, you have to go and get permission for public funding. That takes time. It's scrutinised, as indeed it should be scrutinised, but then there are shortcomings and difficulties in getting that, not least of all the fact that, of course, being public funding, there is restraints and considerable constraints on the funds available. And we could all give examples if you wanted it, but they are there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Lord Mayor.
Well, just following this point, how can it be ensured that a proportionate amount of forensic investigation is taking place? Leaving aside the question about prosecution and defence, just that in an ideal world, one would hope that in any trial that there would be enough forensic investigation undertaken to ensure a fair trial. And so how, in the discussions leading up to the trial between prosecution and defence, and indeed during the trial, how does the system ensure that a proportionate amount of forensic investigation has been done? Leaving aside funding, or maybe funding is the big issue, but just for a moment, leaving aside the funding, how do we know nowadays, with all of the new scientific developments, that there has in fact been enough forensic investigation for the particular trial in question?
I'll give you an example of how it might work in an ordinary murder trial. A murder takes place, and a crime scene manager will go to the scene of the crime together with many others, and will decide on what the, I'm putting this quite broadly, on what the parameters of the testing that must initially be carried out will be. And that is then sent on a submission to the in-house lab, where a senior scientist will decide if that's proportionate or not, or necessary. And so there are gatekeepers all the way who decide how much should be tested and how much doesn't need to be tested, according to what's known about the circumstances of the murder, whether the question is, we know who did it, but the question was why they did it, we don't know who did it, and so on. It depends on what the issues in the case are. Very often there are understandable criticisms that not enough testing has been carried out, but also what is necessary is engagement between all the parties at an early stage, so that the defence case can be known to the Crown, and so that any further testing that should be carried out that may be of assistance to the defence is done in a timely fashion. But I think I can speak for all of us in saying that funding constraints do lead to difficulties in timing, because there aren't enough scientists to carry out all the tests, which means that the Crown's initial results go to the defence, but not always in as timely a fashion as they might. But to go back to your original question, there are checks and balances all the way through to ensure that as much as needs to be done is done, but no more, because it's too expensive. And
the too expensive is the key point here, isn't it? So that it might be agreed by lawyers on both sides that investigations need to be done in a number of different areas on forensic science, but there's a point at which someone says, well, there's no longer the funds to support that. Yes,
and there are some horror stories abounding, and I won't give anecdotal evidence, but in one case, I'll just give you this example. A scientist at the lab refused to test a knife because he said, well, we know this was the murder weapon and we know who wielded it. We need no further tests. Well, you do actually, because if the issue is self-defence, you may need to know what position the fingerprints were on the knife, and whether another knife might have been used in addition, and so on.
But if we can look at it, if I may say so, from a practical point of view, with an example, just developing what Sarah said, the defence, for whatever reason, and on their instructions, will consider that it's necessary to have forensic evidence on a particular issue, maybe because that's the defence, or it may be it's consistent with, of course, their responsibility to prepare the case as fully as possible for their client. And then you can run into, terribly, these funding issues as to whether that will be permitted, whether it's allowed, how much is available. And that really is a real issue. And it can raise difficulties, which I'm sure we've all seen.
I think there's a funding and a manpower issue as well. I'm not sure that there is enough people to do the work. There's been a whole series of high-profile sex offence cases recently which have been dropped because on further analysis of the phone evidence and the digital downloads, the evaluation of the realistic prospect of conviction completely changed, and there was a very high-profile case which was dropped. And I think that there's a very difficult balancing exercise because there's a huge growth in digital evidence with iPhones, computers, all of those sort of things. And often the trail of phone messages and WhatsApp and all the various different things can tell a whole narrative which is potentially either strengthens the prosecution case or undermines the case. But I accept that often the prosecution simply don't have the resources. I mean, recently I was involved in a very substantial firearm conspiracy. There was 8 or 9 defendants, and about 6 or 7 weeks before the case, 30,000 pages of phone evidence was served, which, upon far greater analysis and having taken detailed instructions, changed the case. And we were able to engage with the prosecution in what schedule was presented of that evidence in a format that the jury might understand. But of course that presents real challenges, and in more and more cases that's the type of evidence that is being served.
Lord Fox.
Coming back to the crime scene manager, seems like that person has a central role in directing what forensic information is collected. For whom does the crime scene manager work? Do they have a public duty to collect forensic information on behalf of the defence as well as the prosecution, and how is that policed or managed or whatever?
The crime scene manager is employed by the police and works in conjunction with the senior investigating officer who is allocated to that particular case.
That's kind of what I thought.
Yes.
So there's no public duty to work on the behalf of the defence on that basis?
Well, there is a public duty to investigate a case pursuing all reasonable lines of inquiry.
That doesn't sound like a public duty to work on behalf of, equally on behalf of the defence.
It's to keep an open mind on behalf of everybody, because when a murder takes place, what's important is that it's investigated promptly and diligently, and that in the end the right person is brought to trial.
Of course, justice is what we're looking for.
And so there's no... it isn't really a question of working on behalf of prosecution or defence. It's carrying out the duty.
But kind of once a crime scene is no longer a crime scene, there is no more forensic from that crime scene. So it's a very crucial role that person plays.
Absolutely.
In determining what gets collected and what gets investigated. Thank you.
And these crime scene managers are usually private operators, are they?
No, they work for the police. They work for the police.
They're employed by the police?
Yes.
Okay.
But they do keep... There are policy books are kept on what decisions are made, on what they're deciding to do. Everything is documented and recorded.
What's done is done.
Oh, yes.
And can't be redone, or largely, often
No.
it can't.
But in my experience, although I'm sure my colleagues will speak for themselves, it's rare that something so crucial is missed at a crime scene that it causes a real difficulty later on.
But you suggested that, I don't mean you particular, but all of you suggested that part of the problem is the resources available, both financial and expertise. So apart from funding and resources, or is that the only issue, how else can this be sorted?
Other than funding, there's other issues in relation to the fact that there are less experts. There are less experts available who are willing to do the work. There are less solicitors who are interested in going into legal aid work. A recent survey of the Law Society found that the average age of the duty solicitor in this country is 49, and there are many areas where there isn't sufficient duty solicitor cover, and arguably the role of the duty solicitor, who's giving the first advice both at the police station when a suspect is first arrested and requests a duty solicitor, and a court, is absolutely crucial. And so there's a resource issue with enough...
So this all likely to lead to injustice?
It potentially can lead to injustice, because if there isn't the availability of proper legal advice, then it can lead to injustice. Many of the people who are represented, particularly by the duty solicitor, are vulnerable, disenfranchised, have a number of difficulties, who will potentially say and do things without proper legal advice,
Okay.
which will...
Okay, Lord Griffiths.
The question I wanted to ask was precisely the question my neighbour, Lord Fox, asked, and which was about the crime scene managers. As I listened to your reply, the question going through my mind is the following, that to what extent is there a bias in the system to the prosecution and against the defence? And to what extent, if I lived in a very low-income inner-city family somewhere and I had, say, 3 teenage sons, and they got into trouble with the police and so on, and they got on the other side of the law, to what extent would I have confidence that they were having a fair hearing when the crime scene manager, who is like a quarterback, I mean, he's dictating the game? Is there any way that the public could be given greater confidence in what that key person does? I mean, we would assume that a person acting in that capacity acts in the public interest. So we start from that. But on the other hand, as you said, I mean, there could be miscarriages of justice and so on. And particularly, I think, in the climate we're now in our society, what more can we do to reassure people that this process of justice is actually, the very best that we can have?
Should I start off and first come back on one point which Sarah made about crime scene managers? And the short answer to your question, then I'll develop it, is allow more funds to be available so that, if necessary, cases can be more greatly investigated, and, if necessary, there is availability for the defence in this particular area to instruct more experts. It frankly comes down to the question of funding. Now, I have no doubt, and from my experience, that in the vast majority of cases, the crime scene manager is trying to do his very best, is trying to look at what's happened in an unbiased way to see what has happened and report on that. And of course, he is accountable, and if necessary, what he has undertaken, done or not done, can be examined in detail. But of course, there are constraints on his time and the number of people that there are, as we've already touched upon. And that really what, in my view, it comes down to, because we're all looking over our shoulder, the crime scene manager, the prosecution, what can actually be investigated, how far can they go, the defence, will we get allowances from public funding? And you can well understand why there shouldn't be more public funding. Everyone's trying to save the money. But you go on from there, and then you find at the end of the day in this, well, there may well be miscarriages of justice. It's not because of what we want to do or individuals, it's because things haven't been properly investigated. Why haven't they been properly investigated? Because the funds weren't available, people were looking over their shoulders to save money. That's, I'm afraid it's rather stark, but that would be my reaction to your question.
Okay, Barristers Young.
Before I go on to the question that I wanted to ask, could you just comment briefly on streamlined forensic reporting and whether whether it works or not?
Well, if I can answer that, building on what Michael's just said, streamlined forensic reporting does give us this opportunity very early on, returning to Lord Fox's question, to identify where the scientific evidence falls, sometimes within a matter of hours, while the crime scene is still open. Streamlined forensic reporting has the ability to save a great deal of time and money and to allow early engagement by the defence in obtaining their own forensic experts, if indeed the forensic reports are acted upon as soon as they're handed over to the other side. So broadly, they are a very good tool, but there are caveats. And the caveats are that they're very brief reports. So the report may tell you that a person's DNA is in a particular location, but not necessarily what the source of the DNA was, how much of it there was, and indeed what the significance of it is. So they are a very positive innovation, but all the parties need to use them in the right way.
Can you go on to your question, Barrister Young?
Could Mr. Harris just say what he was going to say? He was
Well, I'm,
clearly very
I'm conscious of
interested.
the time because I got lots more
I'll ask
questions.
my next one will be very short, I promise.
I'll be extremely quick. My view is that in certain cases they are very cost effective and helpful, but there are a number of potential issues with them, which we've already seen in some authorities. The limits of the report can be problematic. Often the actual context of the evidence isn't entirely clear, and if you want to take it further, there's often issues in terms of whether you've got enough information to actually be able to get prior authority to seek your own expert. There's issues with continuity in terms of who does the work and who writes the report. So I do think that there are positives to it, certainly in the less serious cases, perhaps the cases that are generally dealt with in the magistrates' court cases. But I do think that there are potential dangers. And whilst I think it has its positives, I think it does need to be reviewed to take away some of the dangers and problems that have arisen.
Thank you. The question I was supposed to be asking was about disclosure. I mean, obviously that's run into troubles recently, and there's a lot being done to improve the situation. Do you think enough is being done, or is there more that ought to be done to get both pre- and post-trial disclosure sorted out?
Who wants to start?
Should I start by saying this? I think there's a lot that does need to be undertaken, and it really comes down to you've got to look at what the material is to decide whether it should be disclosed. And in order to look at the material, you've got to have people who are able to look at material, look at all the information and evidence. And from my experience as the years have gone on, I'm afraid that recently you come back to manpower and those who can look at it before they can make a judgment call as to what can be and should be disclosed. And because of that, you run into the inevitable difficulty which we've seen, I'm afraid, where on the day of the trial, and sometimes sadly later than that, what should have been disclosed wasn't disclosed, and it's had a crucial effect on the trial process. So I think the answer is there does need to be another look at as to what there should be by way of should be disclosed. I know it's something which is being considered by the Attorney General. We've heard what he said, and there's another committee, of course, did look at that, I think the Justice Committee, and we've all seen their report. But it does come back, I'm afraid, again to the question of manpower.
So who should do it? Who should make the decision?
Well, the decision, of course, is the prosecution have got to look at the material that they have in their locker, so to speak, and they've got to decide whether it meets the criteria that should be disclosed. But I think one of the problems is, do they or are they able to look at all the information that they have and all the evidence which they have, and whether it is evidence which should be disclosed, whether it will undermine their own case, whether it will assist the defence, and those are the criteria. And it's often, it's sadly the situation when one explores this later on when it hasn't been disclosed, you find one of the reasons is because it hasn't been properly looked at. And it may not have been properly looked at because those who are looking at it aren't properly trained. And we all know there are experiences of those who have to carry out the judgment call, perhaps aren't properly trained in certainly forensic issues. So I think those are the difficulties.
So is there a case for a standalone paid-for disclosure expert reaching that view?
Well, if you're asking me personally, we used to have years ago a disclosure officer who did have that job and that duty to do that. And I think that if you were able to and the funds were available, most certainly you should have a standalone person who would look at that. Possibly in the same way, which comes to mind, that many of us remember the days before we had custody officers in the police station, whether someone should be detained and his welfare in the police station was really a matter for the officer in the case. It's much better now you have a standalone officer, the custody officer, who is accountable, who looks at and considers the welfare of someone who's in custody. See no reason why, again, it comes back to funding. But if you want a justice system when you're going to avoid some of the sadnesses which we've had and some of the controversies that we've had about whether someone's had a fair trial or whether there's been a misjustice, and I do think you've really got to consider why is that, and one of the reasons may well be that you don't have in place these type of people who can look at that.
May I make a very important point about disclosure, because this is very often misunderstood. There is no question normally of material existing and never being disclosed to the other side, because in every criminal trial there is a schedule of material that the police have with a brief description of every document and every item, and that schedule is given to the defence in its entirety. So the existence of the material is disclosed in its entirety. That is not often understood, I think, when people talk about disclosure. When people describe disclosure, what they mean is the actual documents being handed over, as opposed to merely appearing as items on a schedule. If the defence wish to see any document on the schedule, they can ask for it. And then if the Crown take the view that it does undermine the prosecution case or assist the defence, it will be handed over. If the Crown and the defence disagree on this, then a judge will make the final decision. So it's very important to understand these schedules are schedules of every piece of material the police have in relation to that case.
I'm afraid I don't totally agree with my colleague, and it may well be that on the type of cases that you do, the schedules are accurate, but in many cases, the less serious type cases, the normal case, the schedules don't always contain all of the items. You frequently get updated schedules very close to the trial. You raise inquiries, and suddenly something comes up and a new schedule appears. And this is because of the varying experience and ability of the person who is completing the schedule and their understanding of the disclosure rules. And I suspect that in most of the very serious trials that are heard at the Old Bailey, you're getting the more experienced and able officers who are completing those schedules. But I don't think that's the case with a large number of your day-to-day bread-and-butter cases, and I do think that that's a problem.
Okay, Dr. True.
I'd like to return to the issue of training in forensic science for lawyers and for judges. And as I understand it, it's not mandatory. So what sort of training in practice do they get? And are there areas which are completely overlooked? Are there specific areas where there should be more training? But what training is available to them? What training in reality do they get, other than, I suppose, experience in court? But that's not training in itself.
Certainly, the judges get very little training. Those who take part in the serious sex course, which is for judges who are going to try serious sexual offences and serious crimes such as murder, have a limited amount of training on their judicial courses. There is none on the recorder course for part-time judges. One of the difficulties about training is that there is such a vast amount of possibility in forensic science. And, of course, you could provide training in DNA, for example, and in particular on the interpretation of DNA results. And the primers produced by the Royal Society are very important development in that area. But you could never train everybody in everything that might arise.
But the range of it, one might expect in bar examinations or something, reference to be made to the range, which you're just emphasising that, and
yes.
That would be an appropriate thing for training to be given
It would, and I think I mentioned earlier the possibility of perhaps suggesting a module on the bar professional training course,
yes,
merely to make people aware of what the range is, and perhaps some training in the most commonly encountered forms of forensic science.
I think the point, your last point there, Sarah, is very important. That it's such a vast subject, forensic science, and every so often you come across something in court which, frankly, you've probably never heard of, and there's an expert in it, quite properly so, and then really you couldn't put that into a training module sensibly. But I think that...
You'd say it's something you haven't heard of. If you had a good training module, you might have heard of it, even if not in any depth.
But it's really a training module, I think, with respect, and I'm all in favour of this, given where we are, would really have to cover, as Sarah said, the more usual types of forensic science that you'll come across, DNA, facial mapping, and these type of things. But it's right, there is not, as far as I know, I don't think there's a module for solicitors. There are very good training courses, and it is something which clearly needs to be looked at. But again, it comes funding and time. And certainly, anecdotally, I can say in the past when I've been involved defending in cases and an issue has come up, sometimes in your own time you've gone off and learnt about it, which can be quite interesting, especially when you never knew it existed in the first place.
Before, I think that's an important point. Yes. Thank you,
Lord Caker.
Well, just to be clear, how can a practitioner feel confident about practicing if they're not trained in the area? I mean, how does one get to a position where one is confident to be able to discharge this hugely important function in the criminal justice system?
Well, I think that there are huge challenges for the practitioner in getting on top of all of the different types of expert evidence. But most practitioners will attend various lectures and updates on scientific evidence. You do tend to learn about a new science partly when you first have to deal with it in a case. I do think that there would be benefit in some kind of formalised educational requirements, or at least some way, as I mentioned before, of being able to issue regular updates about new types of expert evidence. I don't think you're ever going to totally solve the problem that you're addressing, and I think it's a problem that all practitioners, barristers for the prosecution and defence, and the judiciary face. So continuing education and engagement between the experts and the lawyers are the only way to address as best possible that challenge.
So if it's not possible to get the vast amount of knowledge that any given lawyer will need to have, might it be helpful if all lawyers were trained in the basic scientific understanding of the principles and statistics related to it, so that when they're presented with any forensic science evidence, even the one that they've not come across before, they are able to ask the question about the scientific basis of that evidence and the probability of that being accurate or being substantial?
I think that would be a good idea. I think a module on the bar professional training course would be sensible. But it must be remembered that many lawyers may go for 15 years and never see a particular type of forensic science that they may encounter in a case. And lawyers are reasonably bright, in fact, and I don't think that you'd find among many lawyers...
You said it, I
But I don't think most lawyers would come to this committee and say, I don't feel confident in calling this evidence or challenging this evidence. If they were in that position, then they shouldn't be doing the case. But I think most of us feel confident that we can get on top of it in time to properly represent the interests of our clients. But knowledge of statistics and the use of it and this sort of publication is helpful.
Good. Lord Hunt.
Can I just go back to the business of so-called streamlined forensic? I mean, in my own experience in engineering over 50 years, I mean, to start with, people were doing very simple calculations, and then they had packages, and there was a question of, are these computer packages appropriate? And people are trained on them. And you can imagine in forensic there's a lot of computer packages which would provide you with assistance. And I think, is that the direction you're going in? I mean, obviously there's the statistics you've mentioned, but also the business of how a human body responds to being knocked and so on and so on. I mean, is that the trend that's going to happen? And nowadays there are remarkable computer simulations of lots and lots of different types of nasty things that might happen.
Yes.
And is this as it were, a pretty strong line of progress.
Well, I think it's getting more complicated, more complex perhaps is a better word. All forensic science, it seems to me, certainly. And I think there are potential shortcomings in streamlined forensic science, because often by its very nature it's short and it's very shortly written, and there can be problems. Sometimes perhaps it isn't properly understood. But certainly with the complexities as we see, I think from what I see, that is the way that we are going. And I think that's underlined by the fact that a number of the disciplines you see now, the expertise you see now, weren't heard of even a decade ago.
Well, quite. Yeah.
Listening to the picture you paint, I'm quite struck by, on the one hand, not any very formalised educational requirements in relation to understanding forensic evidence, limited funding for access to expertise, with the danger of price in the end trumping potentially the quality of the help you get, and thinness in the system generally. And this is against the background, it seems to me, of what you have both all of you remarked on, and I think does strike the members of the committee, is that as we enter, well, in fact we're in the digital age, but as it gets itself more complex, the ability actually both to produce relevant evidence and understand what it means seems to me to be going to increase very greatly. So my question to you really is, it's a system design question. It seems to me that well, the question I want to ask you is how, if you had the opportunity to do a bit of system design, how would you go about trying to actually improve the ability of the forensic expert, first of all, to give you good advice, and to be sufficiently innovative that your job's also made easier when you're, in a sense, consuming the advice and the evidence, and then using it in a criminal trial. And how can that be done in a way that really serves the needs of the criminal justice system? I mean, I'm asking you now to pitch into an ideal world and say what you'd like to see happen and what you think the really important things are that you should be trying to do.
That's a very broad question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Across a very vast field, because in the familiar areas of forensic science, there aren't, perhaps I'm being overly Pollyanna-ish, but there aren't really too many difficulties about, for example, pathology or DNA testing, those sorts of areas. The really problematic area is digital evidence, because it is vast and getting bigger, and because it's constantly software's being updated, operating systems are being updated, and many experts themselves, I have the impression, are struggling to keep up with what's available.
So the criminal justice system and the forensic world have to work together. And so my question to you
They
is,
do.
how would you go about designing an improvement in the system?
They do. Well, the system actually works reasonably well. Communication between experts and lawyers and judges, in my experience, is very good. Communication between experts is very good. They're getting increasingly good at producing agreed statements of agreement and dispute, for example. And communications are generally good. It can, of course, be improved. One can set up panels. As Paul suggested earlier, you could have a panel who issue updates, although who would pay for that and who would sit on it is another matter.
But I'm positing an ideal world. Think of something that would actually provide it. I'm really out trying to elicit some system reform.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm really reinventing what previously existed, where there was a public body, the Forensic Science Service, that was a leading institution in the world for research into expertise, where you had lots of independent experts working there, who the defence also had access to, who led research and who developed various different new expertise. And that was based on quality largely, rather than perhaps economics and getting the cheapest price. And I thought that was a really good thing in equipping the criminal justice system for the challenges that new scientific evidence presented. And whilst I appreciate it may be unrealistic to go back, but having some kind of body that deals with digital evidence, I think would be really, really helpful, because if you think about it, it spans across so many different types of crimes, and cybercrime, terrorism, fraud, serious sexual offences, huge security issues. It's absolutely massive, and interfering in democracy, even, all those sorts of things. So to have a proper publicly funded body to look at those issues and to move things forward that can work side by side with the criminal justice system, which we did, I accept, partly have, I think it would be a really, really good way forward, and would be better than the current system that we have, which I don't think does work, because the police are under huge financial pressure. So I think that they have to take economic decisions about what expert work to commission, and there's bound to be situations where that doesn't necessarily coincide with the interests of justice.
Yeah.
I think what I say to you in this brave new world that we'd like to see is that I agree entirely with Paul. You do need a body, a central body, which is going to deal with all the forensic issues. So you'll then, the lawyers, defence or prosecution, are then dealing with one body when it comes to any kind of, obviously, expertise. That's the first thing. The second thing is, sadly, you would have to look at the funding of all of this, because it would need and must have a relaxation, if I can be kind about it, to allow the prosecution and the defence to explore more issues. I mean, the prosecution have their problems, which Sarah's mentioned. The constraints on the system, you've heard about what the defence have, and people may well say, well, complaining about the same old things. But unless you relax that, you're going to be forced with the same problem down the road as we see now, with arguments and possible miscarriages of justice. So I think that's, if I were truthful to say, we'd have to do. But again, it does come back, sadly, to the same problem. Unless the money is going to be made available, we aren't going to be able to advance this.
Could I ask you, I mean, you said, I think, that difficult to go back or to possibly publicly funded service. Question, would it be feasible, do you think, if it didn't do that, to build that sort of expertise that you're talking about, based on, say, university departments suitably funded? Would that be a way forward, where you get a sufficient research base, as well as
speaking for myself,
as capacity for innovation? I mean, should the research councils be looking at this?
Well, I think you do need an independent body of some kind. Now, it may well be they can call upon quite properly the expertise elsewhere, but I think it needs to be an independent body.
You need a panel of some kind, you mean?
Yes, yes. And you see, when I started off in practice, and you were defending someone, if your leading counsel said that you needed an expert's report, he wrote an opinion, and that was sufficient for you to employ an expert. And the council and you then saw them in conference. Now, except things have moved on, you can't do that. But with the restraints that there are at the moment, there are the difficulties which are there, which I think sadly have led to the problems which we now encounter, which we all know about. And therefore I think there would have to be, if you're asking me for this model looking into the crystal ball, certainly independent organisation to work with the lawyers and the judges as well, who play an increasing part in this. And there is cooperation, as Sarah said, there's no question about it.
So if there was such a body, how significantly would it improve in terms of outcome in criminal justice system?
Well, I think that what it would do is it would avoid, in some cases, the arguments which you have later on about why wasn't a report available, why couldn't we get one, why weren't the court allowed to have one, and did that mean that there was a miscarriage of justice? It's not going to be the panacea for everything. It can't be. There's always going to be potential miscarriage of justice, but I think you would decrease that significantly if you did have this body that we could all look to and allow the funds to be available for both the prosecution and the defence to use.
So you're suggesting an independent... The Forensic Science Service was funded was owned by the government.
Yes.
But are you suggesting that there would be a body of scientists that defence and prosecution could both draw on?
Well, the defence and prosecution could both partly draw on that body. And I was just going to add to what Michael said, but such a body could also regulate the experts and their expertise. So you could have approved experts, you could have approved rates, so you could cut through some of the bureaucracy in the defence seeking to obtain expert advice. One of the constant challenges that courts face is whether what the expert is giving evidence about is within his expertise, whether it goes beyond what he should be saying. Lots of those things could also be addressed in such a panel. You could really look at expert evidence in its entirety and assisting both the prosecution, the defence and justice.
Okay, Lord Fox, do you want to move on to... No, you can go on to your question.
Okay, on my question, yeah, well, I think we've covered digital somewhat and the load, the evidence load that it generates. Are we right in assuming that you think that is putting a real strain on the system? Given that's the case, I think coming back to this prosecution and defence issue, is it putting more strain on the defence than the prosecution, or is there an equal jeopardy in this process? And in a sense, what can be done other than, I think we've talked about the financial side and some of the other things, but are there other things around skills or automated systems or whatever that need to be put in place to try to alleviate the workloads that it's creating?
I think earlier disclosure would help of digital evidence. Often we get it very late. I think if we get it...
being the defence, for clarity.
Yes, apologies, yes. I think the defence would benefit from earlier disclosure of digital evidence. Often it's voluminous. It would enable us more time to consider it, more time to get expert evidence if necessary. It would remove some of the pressure on the system. There's a huge reluctance to adjourn trials, and that creates often a very unreasonable pressure on both prosecution and defence in terms of considering material that arises. So I think that's one step that would make a difference.
I'm afraid it does come down to resources again, because whenever a computer or telephones or multiple telephones are seized, they're sent to a place called the Hub in London, where there are very limited numbers of officers who are responsible for ensuring that the data on those devices is kept, that the integrity is preserved and that copies are made which are perfect. And the reason why there is often very late sharing of this information with the other side is simply because there are hordes of devices waiting backed up to be downloaded.
Understood.
It is resources. If you have those available, I think a lot of issues will be resolved.
But I can say, though, that there are systems already in place for trying to ensure, by cooperation between defence and prosecution, that what is extracted from those is relevant data that's extracted. And
well, that's the other point, is what can be disclosed across to the defence, given that some of the information isn't appropriate for disclosure. And that decision-making process, presumably, is quite a lengthy process.
So what we have are disclosure management documents, whereby the prosecution produce a policy. This is how we're going to interrogate this computer. These are the key terms we're going to ask for. We're going to ask for certain search phrases. Now, defence, tell us, is that correct? Should we widen the parameters? Is there anything else we should be searching for? And that does enable.
But of course, photography is very difficult to then. You've got lots of photographs which search phrases are not.
Absolutely.
And
telephone downloads.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult. Very difficult.
Okay.
Lots of personal data.
Yeah, that's the problem. It's
It
that
is.
Lord Thomas.
between the two.
Can I just ask one question in relation to searching using the sort of system that are used in civil cases? What progress is being made on that, and does the defence cooperate? Because there doesn't seem to be much evidence that this is going forward at the pace needed.
I think one of the problems in relation to that is because of the way the civil system works is different to the way the the criminal system works, which means that sometimes it wouldn't be totally appropriate. Also, you have issues with the language that is used when you're doing some kind of search. In a criminal case, there's often a whole hidden undercurrent of different words to describe drugs, drop-offs, firearms and things like that, which I think makes conducting these types of searches harder. Also one of the issues is in terms of getting the funding for the defence to properly contribute. So I think that there are different challenges for civil and criminal, but clearly the current manual way of trawling through lots of digital downloads and text takes a huge amount of time, and looking at ways of short-circuiting that are important. But I do think that the challenges between civil and crime are very different in terms of what's at stake.
I follow that, but is the problem you don't want to agree search terms as that might give too much away, or is that the problem? But how do we cope in the end with this vast amount of documentation, material on the phone, unless you can agree search terms?
Quite.
I mean, I think it may be an insoluble conundrum, but we have to solve it.
I agree, and I apologise for putting my defence lawyer hat on, but
that's your job.
I'm here for. But it does depend largely on the disclosure that we've received before that. It does depend on what instructions, if any, our client can give, and providing the appropriate advice before volunteering those kinds of terms. But I recognise that it's something that needs to be addressed, because, for example, often what happens is if a defence want to carry out those searches on their own to look at the material themselves, and again that takes up a large amount of manpower and resources, which often simply isn't available.
But you're quite right. If the defence engage early, Paul says that sometimes isn't appropriate to do so, but early engagement as to what the issues are can really benefit the defendant in ensuring that the searches are properly targeted.
So, we've identified across through this inquiry lots of issues related to training, related to forensic service availability, both for prosecution and defence. Is there a body that says to Home Office or Justice Department what the problems are in terms of forensic science and its delivery to the criminal justice system?
Several bodies, I would have thought. The Criminal Bar Association.
How effective are they
being
doing
one.
this?
I would have thought that they are very effective, but again, I can't give chapter and verse. They're certainly a powerful body, and they have a voice. At the moment, they have some other considerations to deal with, in particular the funding of the criminal justice system generally. But the solicitors maybe also have some input here as well.
The London Criminal Court Solicitors Association frequently respond on consultations, engage, have seats on many of the committees, many of the boards, and make representations. Again, they also have similar challenges to the Criminal Bar Association in relation to funding overall of the criminal justice system, of which this, though, is a very important part.
Okay, Lord Hunt and then Lord Kicker.
I was going to ask, I mean, we keep calling for more effective forensic data and so on and so on. So has anybody done an economic study on this? Is kind of thing, question my other colleagues might ask. What is the economic benefit of having essentially a more accurate and reliable criminal justice system? And has this been studied? Because that's the question. I mean, you know, the government it's not just the question of is there money, isn't there money? In government, normally the question is you find an economic case for spending the money. And has that been done? And we haven't heard about it.
Well, sorry if I can just say, we all, I'm sure, accept that the whole purpose of the criminal justice system is to ensure that those who commit offences are brought to trial and convicted, and those who are innocent are found not guilty. You have, especially we've seen in recent years, what appears to be an upturn of complaints about disclosure and complaints about miscarriages of justice, and rather trenchant comments made, of course, by the courts. Isn't that really the answer as to why you need to ensure that you do have the best available criminal justice system so it can carry out what I've just said, which I know everyone will agree to? And how you'd measure that in...
Well, that's the point. Everything is done by measurement now, isn't it? I mean, and nobody believes anything until you find a economic case.
Therefore, do you want to, I suppose, cut the funding, as appears to be going on year, both the prosecution and the defence, and have potentially further complaints, controversies and miscarriages of justice? Or do you want to put the funding in place to try to ensure that doesn't happen?
Okay, Lord Keeker.
Lord Chairman, thank you. I think we probably covered this, but just for good order and completeness, could you give a single recommendation that you think would be the most beneficial in terms of securing the impact appropriately of high-quality forensic science in the criminal justice system?
I think what I would say, I've left aside money, of course, is I think a new central body that would be accountable.
Central body for delivering the forensic science service?
Yes,
right,
yes.
Very good, thank you.
I would agree with that, perhaps a royal society of some sort. If it were one that were accepted by everybody in the criminal justice system as being one that is described as independent.
Or delivering, or both?
Both.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think linked to that is a panel to improve communication and education, which is made up of forensic scientists, judiciary and lawyers for both sides. But I think that's linked to that can be linked to the other body.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Sorry, Lord Griffiths.
Would there be any concern that you're creating a monopoly?
That would have been my concern, but my colleagues who defend say that they would call it an independent body that both sides, that all parties could rely upon. But I agree with you. I mean, the whole idea of abolishing the forensic science service as it was that there could be a free market in the provision of forensic science.
But the market isn't working.
No, I don't.
Well,
a free market was. We went in that direction also partly for the probation service and the prisons, and I personally don't think it's worked in relation to that either. And I think something about in relation to criminal justice, I'm not sure having a competitive market where the lowest price is necessarily consistent with having a proper functioning justice system. And actually I think that's kind of almost more important than the economic argument, although I would add that if lots of cases are adjourned because disclosure isn't completed, if there's lots of appeals which are successful, then that creates a false economy because there's extra costs at the end which may not have been incurred had the job been done properly earlier.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. It's been most helpful for us, and I hope you'll get a transcript. And if you have any corrections, please let us know. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Indian. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon to help us with our inquiry. If, for the record, if you don't mind saying who you are, so we get it on record, and then if you have a statement to make, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll go on to the questions.
So thank you very much for inviting me. My name's Rebecca Endine. I'm the Director of Strategy at UK Research and Innovation. I'll just say maybe a couple of words before I start. Is obviously forensic science has to be critical for the effective working of the justice system, both in terms of efficiency and efficacy. It's clearly very important, and UKRI plays a very strong role in funding the fundamental science that provides discoveries across a broad range of disciplines, which are then implemented to be put in practice to make the criminal justice system work harder. We are conscious, one of the jobs of UKRI is to make sure that we join up better with government and across the disciplines to fund research and innovation that makes a difference, and this is clearly an area where we should do that.
Okay, so you've recognized that there is a need in your strategy to address the issue about forensic science and whether there is a need to support that area of research and innovation. Is that correct?
I think it is. I think it's correct, and I also think that just as a preamble is, I think it'd be wrong to make the assumption that we do not support it at the moment. Before I came in, we did a trawl of the last 10 years of Research Council funded projects, and over that 10 years we funded 143 separate grants. That's £52 million worth of research.
This was in forensic science?
Yeah, no, so this was specifically where forensic science was mentioned in the title or in the abstract of the grant application. So it was specifically aimed to have an impact on forensic science. Now, of course, as you'll be very aware, a lot of the discoveries that have an impact on forensic science are they come from the serendipitous, and therefore they come from research, where we never intended to find out something that was useful for forensic science, but then we did. And we think that, there's at least another 25 million over that 10-year period where the research was intended to find something else, but it actually yielded something that was useful for forensic science. I think the best example of that is a NERC project where it set out to look at measuring ancient footprints and how they evolved over time, and then that ended up being very useful for the footprint analysis, and it's now used in the Forensic Science Service. So there's quite a lot of projects of that nature.
So presumably most of your research funding in the future, I'm talking about, will be on the same mode as it's been in the past. There is a responsive-based funding. So I apply for a grant, you assess it. But how, in your strategy, is there a possibility that you might look at areas that ought to be funded but are not? And if you take forensic science, for instance, there is an increasing, clearly, need for innovations in both digital and cyber forensics, for instance.
So I just point out that the responsive mode does throw up some very interesting interdisciplinary research projects in that area. We've just funded one in Cambridge, countering crime in the cloud, which has funded both EPSRC and ESRC, 1.9 million. So our responsive mode does actually throw up quite a few of those individual projects. But I am sure that there is more to be done in that in the future. We were very lucky to receive additional money from the government in Autumn Statement 2019. It hasn't been channelled into responsive mode funding. It's been channelled into a range of different funds. We're funding an awful lot additional talent in terms of future leader fellows and PhDs, some of them in subjects very relevant to this particular area like AI and data science. We also have the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, which is about solving some of the key challenges facing industry at the moment. But we also have something called the Strategic Priorities Fund, which has three main objectives. One objective is to fund groundbreaking interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary science. Secondly, it's to work cross-government on government priorities. And thirdly, it's there to just fund really novel and interesting things. We've just announced the first projects from that fund. They're mostly, the first ones are mostly in climate change areas. But there is, I think, the potential going forward to work across government with the Home Office, with the MOJ, to actually fund more strategic projects of that nature. I would say maybe two things which are actually critically important to do that. I think it's one is that we have to work very closely with the Home Office and with the MOJ and with the Judiciary and with Julie Maxton's group in the that she's put together on science and justice to make sure that what we fund is what is needed. That, you know, there's a bit of job to work out. I mean, to say that forensic science is a strategic priority is one thing. To actually work out, well, what is the actual critical things that we should be funding, and how do we best join up across the landscape is another issue. And the second thing I would say is that, you know, some of the most important discoveries that have been made that have had really important implications for forensic science, they weren't discovered through a call which was about the past. They were discovered about a call with us the future, and you don't necessarily know what's going to be the most important things for forensic science a priori. So we would still want to keep some broad responsive mode funding.
So if this committee ended up recommending a way forward for forensic science innovations, is that something that you'll find helpful?
I think the thing that we would, if you look at this landscape in particular, it is quite fragmented. We do fund, I mean, we currently fund quite a lot of research which is useful in this area. The Home Office funds some. Julie's doing some great work with her particular group. I think that one of the most important things that we could probably do, and I think Julie made this suggestion when she came to talk to you, which is that there might be a scope for some sort of strategic oversight body which could look at across all the funders that there are and identify gaps and, you know, key priorities for funding forensic science research. I think that sort of strategic oversight body would be very useful.
Baroness Young.
Yeah. I think you've answered this question really already, particularly in respect to the Strategic Priorities Fund, because it does seem that forensics is a kind of orphan in the storm. You know, it doesn't sit under any particular council. It's not, from the evidence we've been given so far, been terribly good at pulling together its own priorities for research and then coming to find funding for them. So it sounds like your overarching body might well be the best answer.
I'd say a couple of things is that when we looked at what we'd funded that was relevant to forensic science, it covered every single council funded something. You know, even the arts and humanities had, you know, funded some ancient fingerprints on seals research, which was very, very useful. And that is the part of the problem, I think, of forensic science, is it's so broad. There are discoveries which cut across every single area of research, which can then be useful. So I think it's just more of a job pulling it all together. I think there's in terms of the overarching body idea, there's an example of this that exists already in health research, which is called OSCA, which is the Office for Strategic Coordination of Health Research, which brings together all the different NIHR and ourselves and devolved administrations, etc., to talk and set about, and practitioners. Practitioners are really very important in this agenda, and that works quite well. You know, you could see something like this, which, I mean, it wouldn't control the money, but it would control, you know, this is what the priorities are, these are what the gaps are, and my instinct is that is what is lacking at the moment. Thank you.
Lord Fox and Lord Kaker.
Is there a problem of naming here, and because forensic science is applied science,
yeah,
and by having a discipline of forensic, well, or sort of pseudo discipline, because it's so many different disciplines,
yeah,
of forensic science, does this create a barrier to entry and also sort of barriers for the flow of science into forensic use, or is it not an issue at all?
I don't think that's an issue. I mean, I think forensic science is the application of discoveries across a broad range of different science and research methods, and often it's the application that makes it multidisciplinary. So,
well, what I'm really saying is, does the fact that we call it, there's forensic science and it's this thing, does that stop people doing it? Does it stop science flowing into that area, or does it flow naturally anyway?
I think it flows naturally.
Okay.
My instinct is it's very interesting. You can clearly see the public good that's come from it. I mean, I think the implementation. Forensic science is about the implementation of the discoveries, and I guess if there's a gap, it's around that implementation area, which falls between the Home Office, the police forces, the judiciary, and ourselves. And I think that is probably where the gap is in terms of the area that needs some attention.
Lord Kaker, then Lord Thomas.
Lord Chairman, just to... you mentioned a number of different bodies who are contributing funding for research in the area of forensic science. What proportion do you think has come from the research councils of that, and what proportion from those others? Do you have any sense of that?
I don't have any sense. I think one of the things that Julie's trying to do in her... Sorry, this is Dr. Julie Maxson, in her science and research group is to actually map that funding. And I think that would be... a very useful thing to do. Instinctively, I suspect that we might provide the lion's share if you could add it up. I think if you look at the landscape, there's, and you can tell this from various REF case studies, there's lots of interaction at a local level between local universities and local police forces, local criminal justice systems, which is a sort of endogenous thing which you probably would want to encourage and not stop because it's a really good thing to do. But I think getting a grip of where that's happening across the piece would be a really good idea. If I had to guess, I would say we probably spend more than anybody else.
Do you think if you looked at all the academic institutions and looked at where the forensic science research is being done, that you'll find that research councils are major funders?
I think you probably would.
Are you sure of that?
Well, I think if you included the QR funding that throws through Research England as well as the research, so all of UKRI funding, so it has got the QR funding and all the Research Council. But I can't prove that at all because we probably know how much we spend very broadly. I'm not sure.
Well, for instance, recently Liverpool funded 3 forensic units at £10 million each. Is that correct?
So I think it was 10 million over a number of years. One 10 million over a number of years. I don't think it was 10 million per annum.
Okay.
Yeah. So I suspect that's. I think the level human was relatively small. Sorry.
Yeah.
Lord Kicker, Lord
just to come back to one other point, you had suggested the creation of an Oscar-like body.
Yeah.
Where should that sit?
Sorry, I'm inventing something. I hope my colleagues elsewhere don't think it's a bad idea. If you take the Oscar model, there's an independent chair, and the independent chair is appointed by the DH. And so my guess that you would do the same thing. You'd have some sort of independent chair to bring it all together, because that is a way of bringing all the different parties to the table.
Thank you.
Lord Thomas.
Certainly the impression I've had from the evidence is forensic practitioners believe that actually very little money is spent on research. You've mentioned two things, which the work you've done on footprints and the work you've done on fingerprints have contributed to the advancement of forensic science.
Sure.
But would you be able to let us know the precise way and other instances, so the so that the forensic community could see that you're actually spending a lot of money?
Yeah, so we looked over the past 10 years. I can write to, so I should have written to you beforehand. I can write to you and outline what they are.
But what one often sees from research, that I'd like to know actually what is the specific benefit, because we went for a fingerprint, the Scotland Yard's fingerprint bureau. And it would be fascinating to find out, because because fingerprinting is something that isn't really a science here. It'd be interesting to know what you've done, and in footprint, which again is not the same, actually what difference it's actually made, so we could show people they were under a misconception, or that the research councils are under a misconception. One or the other has a misconception. We'd like to know which.
Okay, so I can definitely write to you with details of what we've spent the money on in the last 10 years and what sort of projects. I would say that the science of fingerprinting is about 100 years old. So the science of footprints and gait and the way people walk is much more recent. And also things like rapid DNA testing and digital stuff. And I think we might find that more of our research is in more of those sort of areas than fingerprinting.
All I wanted to know is what is it in detail, so someone can be disabused of a misconception.
If I might ask also, for those 140 odd projects that have been supported over the 10-year period, do you have any kind of information demonstrating how the outputs of that research were published? Were they in peer-reviewed journals in the way that much of the other research that you support through UKRI and the research councils would be, and there would be an expectation for that?
Where they are completed, we can do, but a lot of these will be in-flight projects, but we can have a look.
Thank you.
Okay. Lord Hunt, quickly.
Can I just ask you, I've personally worked on particles and indeed worked on a motor trial on that, which used the very latest ideas of particles and jets and all sorts of things. But and I just wonder, this is an example where the research being funded comes out of sort of quite basic support, and it may be that by flagging up, this is sort of what you're saying, by flagging up the connections between research of fundamental nature and its application, you could actually get more people, as it were describing, making the case for their fundamental research, because it has this application. It seems to me it's the same with computer systems and data and so on. So it's a good badge, or a good peg to hang a lot of applications. Because I think one of the things scientists in universities have difficulty know is where this is an idea, how can I find an application of this? And I think you could do more with the forensic knowledge, flagging this up, because there's a lot of really. I mean, for example, the group at Imperial College who do all the flow in and out of aspects of the head and the chest and so on. All of that, is useful in a forensic way. And indeed, somebody from the Imperial College group, did some amazing tricks to show that the jury, what he did, he got a pen, stuck it up his nose, and so this is the way, the airflow and the particles move. Greatly impressed the jury. But more seriously, this is an example, of connections between fundamental research and its application in this area, which could be, I think, more explained to people with some benefits.
I completely agree, and. And it's worth saying at the next ref we're going to put a tag on all submissions that have a forensic science implication so that we can try and draw them together and ensure they're assessed properly. And we think that would be quite a useful way of being able to draw together all the sort of really good case studies across the whole scientific endeavour which have implications for forensics.
Okay, Lord Borwick.
When you mentioned earlier that the total amount over the last 10 years is 52 million and 143 different studies, what percentage of the total expenditure of UKRI was that?
Would be relatively small. So the annual expenditure of UKRI over that 10-year period would have been roughly £6 billion per annum. So it would be, my guess, 1%. I don't have to go and work that, but it is a relatively small percentage.
Tiny, really, considering the importance in every single stuff.
Yeah.
And yet, the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee has recommended a number of times, going back several years, that it should be a research priority. And we hear that it's not a research priority in any of the UK research councils. Do you think that really we have been taking seriously these select committees' recommendations that have been approved by the government? Doesn't it sound as though it's been accepted as an interesting idea by Parliament, and then we end up with less than 1% actually spent on that?
I think it's quite tricky to comment on the predecessor bodies. I do think that they have funded some really excellent research in this area.
In that 52 million?
Well, that 52 million are projects where you can clearly identify at the outset of the project that this was driven by the need for to fund developments in forensic science. It will be supplemented by a large number of projects which were not set out to meet a forensic science need, but actually did deliver some benefits. So I think the 52 million is, the lower band of it. I do know that the research councils over a number of years did spend quite a lot of activity working with stakeholders, with different government departments on this. And I think I don't want to be. I think it's important to set strategic priorities, but I think setting a strategic priority is not enough. What we really need to do is understand what is required, what is best funded by UKRI, what is best funded by government departments, and look at the overall landscape. And then that gives us a more specific thing to work with. And if I had to say what was lacking over the last period, is probably that really good join-up between the councils and the government departments who work in this area, and I think that should be the priority going forward.
Yes, but sorry, you mentioned the 10 years and the 142 rather than us.
Yes.
I was just picking that up as a theme that you had brought into. But even if you took the last year, it's still a tiny percentage of the total research, and yet we're hearing that as a percentage of the importance in each case, it's going up and up and up. Doesn't this sort of shout that there's a problem here?
There is potentially a problem, but as I said before, I would really want to understand what the needs are. What is it that isn't being funded that should be funded, and actually make sure we get a clear understanding of that landscape, and then we would make the case for additional funding in those particular areas.
But if it has been agreed, recommended by a select committee and accepted by the government that it should be a priority, do you actually have to look at the details as to what is the importance within that priority, or should it be accepted as a priority because it's been recommended by Parliament, and then allocate the money accordingly and let that be judged as to whether it's well spent?
we always have a duty to ensure that we spend money efficiently and effectively, and so we can have a strategic priority, but we also need to make sure that we choose the best possible research projects and they're aligned and they work efficiently. So I think we would also, as well as having it as a strategic priority, we would also need to make sure that what we were doing was the right thing, and that does involve proper engagement with the Home Office, with the MOJ, with other partners and practitioners to make sure that what we're funding adds value.
Do you think that the other departments that you mentioned have got the importance that we are finding in this committee of the Forensic Society? Will it still be an orphan in 5 years' time, or will that?
I think they do understand the importance, and actually I think with the way the digital world is changing, it's obviously going to be a critical issue going forward. The Home Office asked Dr. Julie Maxton to set up the Science and Research Forum, exactly following a report written by Sir Mark Walpole, who's now my boss, who looked at the whole issue of forensic science. And I think it's that join up that we need to focus on, and I would be surprised if this wasn't continuing to be an important priority and growing priority over time.
Okay.
Okay, you finished?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, I think Lord Mayor, you had sorry, Barristers Young.
I just wanted to ask, we've been searching in the forensic science field for leadership, and not really finding it. Is there another sector that you can think of that falls into the same category of actually being covered by a number of research councils, but that's done better in pulling together its own sense of priorities and coming to the research council community that the forensics people could learn from, or are all of those areas that are genuinely across many disciplines floundering around and making a pig's ear of it, if you'll pardon my technical term?
I don't think I could agree with the last bit. I think forensic science is particularly difficult because it does cover practically every discipline, and it's not always obvious what the implications are when you're doing the discovery research. But there are other areas. There's work going on in public health, for example, where a lot of the interesting research that relates to public health is actually economic and social research rather than medical research, and there's work looking at a join up across those elements. I think
they've been more competent at identifying their priorities.
I think they have been slightly better. So Chris Whitty, who is the Chief Scientific Advisor in DH, is doing a particular work in this area at the moment to try. He's got a group which he's got Professor Anne Jackson chairs, which is trying to do exactly that at the moment, looking at priorities for public health, where the research is so cross-cutting. So I think the issues around forensic science are particularly difficult because you've got two government departments, you've got lots of different practitioner groups on the ground, and you've got a number of different research councils. So it is probably as disparate as it.
I think Lord Mayor's question might help take it a bit forward. Lord Mayor.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I was going to return to your point when you talked about the 143 projects. They all would have, over the last 10 years, they would all have been on responsive mode.
All on responsive mode.
So in other words, they were absolutely waiting for the Research Council, waiting for the universities to
come up with good
ideas. But were you to go down the line of a strategic priority, and that would point more towards dedicated calls, wouldn't it? And if you were trying to do that, I guess the question I have really is how do you formulate those dedicated calls? Would you be consulting the forensic science world and coming up with ideas and then coming through with dedicated calls. I mean, one example, one suggestion that we all, many of us visited the Metropolitan Police forensic laboratory, and we were shown the fingerprinting operation, which relies very heavily on experienced people. And we were quite surprised that in the world of artificial intelligence and machine learning and computer vision techniques, that isn't at present used in the fingerprinting world. And might that be the sort of thing a dedicated call could be seeking research proposals on?
I think on that particular question, I think it's worth talking to the Alan Turing Institute, because we are actually funding them to help improve public services, and that's an example where they can use AI and big data techniques. Sorry, this is not answering your question, but I would definitely recommend that the Mets talk to the Alan Turing Institute, because they could well help them, and we do provide funding for them for exactly that sort of issue. I think we would, if we were going to have a specific call in the area of forensic science, my advice would be to make it quite have quite clear goals and objectives which are worked out with the forensic science committee and community, and not make it too general.
Yep.
And that would require consultation with all the key players to say, well, what are the most important things you don't know, and what would you actually leave? I think if you make it too general, you will it will be difficult to work out where the value add is, and also I think there is just a risk that you will get a lot of stuff which is not very good.
Yes.
Through this inquiry, what we gain is that there's a problem. The forensic science evidence is extremely important to criminal justice system, but there are problems arising. One, because we do not have a national forensic service that will provide that service, but also engage in innovations and research.
Yeah.
So it is relied on the police, who then have to find private practitioners who don't themselves do any innovations because they're not funded enough to make enough profit so that they go to innovations. And if we now do not have a government-backed or a research council-backed innovations occurring when there is clear evidence that more and more forensic is required, not only in the existing areas that we know about, but innovations in digital, that Lord Mayor just mentioned about AI, in digital and cyber, not only for criminal justice system, but prevention of crime, and also for democracy, as somebody mentioned earlier on. So where does the Research Council see its role in promoting this kind of science?
I mean, I think in terms of innovation, we do have both Innovate UK funding, which will be available to private sector companies who want to innovate in this particular area. But we also do provide innovation funding through various research councils, which can be used to help the forensic science service. So we have, for example, in rapid DNA testing, provided Innovate funding through BBSRC, and in fact the Innovator of the Year 2016 was a BBSRC fundee who did a lot of work for the Forensic Science Service on rapid DNA. So there is definitely a role that we can provide in terms of funding the basic science and also innovation funding, follow-on innovation funding. I wouldn't see that necessarily as solely the role of UK Research and Innovation. There has to be a role for the government departments to do this. And there are a range of tools available for them, but I think it's important that government departments see this as their role, because they are the final consumers of this innovation, and if they commission it, it's more likely to be relevant for them.
So that's how I would like saying health service should fund all research because they're final consumers of research.
I think it's more, the innovation is more likely to be relevant to the practitioners if the practitioners are involved in its design. and funding.
I won't pursue it further. Lord Hunt.
Can I just ask a question? All your replies are quite similar to replies I've heard from research councils for 30, 40 years. And one of my sort of concern is, and I've encouraged them, is the creation of networks, research networks, focused on something.
Yeah.
So I helped set up this European research GovTech, and then we have subgroups within that are specialists, and then these people who work in this informal network then have to go off to research councils. But the research councils, particularly in the UK, have not been particularly encouraging, though that has begun to change. You have begun to, as it were, support this. So my question really is, do we have the right technical networks to support this? Because when they work well, for example, there's one in the GovTech about particles and how they go,
yeah,
and all that kind of thing. And it's an extremely effective way of doing it in Brussels. And Brussels always supports these kind of, of the European Commission. So I just wondered whether, because here we have, if I may say so, a rather weak sort of informal group that runs forensics. The question really is whether you EPSRC are actually supporting this, and will that be exactly an effective way of using your money? And as I say, your research council has now set up some of these research networks that weren't there before, and they then connect into the European ones. So I'm just because the way, if I may paraphrase what you were saying, you have these researchers, they put in applications, some of them have these applications, but you don't say, starting at the back, what kind of network should we have, which will ensure that we do the research and have the application?
I think that's a very good point, and I think I should go back and check that we do actually have the right sort of networks. We have lots of interaction with various What Works institutes and various institutes across the country which look at this area, but whether we should fund a specific network on forensic science probably requires looking at. That's a good,
okay.
That's a good
Thank you very much. Barrister Neville Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. You said earlier on that the UKRI was, I think you said, tagging some of the grants. Am I right? Am I right in thinking that it's the forensic science element in these, that you want to see how they relate to each other? Could you just explain what you...
So what I was referring to was in the next REF research action framework. As you know, there's so many units of assessment for all the different disciplines, and what we've agreed is that if there is a forensic science application from any of the impact case studies, we would actually get the university people to tag this, to mark it up when it gets sent in, for two reasons. One is then we can aggregate them all up and have a look across all of the submissions to the Research Excellence Framework exercise to see where there is an implication for forensic science or not. But also that when we're doing the actual Research Excellence process, we can ensure that it gets assessed properly so that the impact on the forensic science impact of that particular case study can be looked at properly. And I think there's been a lot of discussion with the community over a number of years to look at that. And I think it's a very sensible solution rather than trying to create a forensic science unit of assessment when we know that the underpinning science is so broad.
I mean, it seems to me, if I might say so, that is sort of writ small, something which I feel emerges from what you're saying, which is that there is need for a consultation exercise, actually, to see where the gaps are. I mean, the evidence we've heard, and this now comes from all corners really, is that the quality of forensic science in this country is in very severe danger of declining, to the detriment of the criminal justice system. And there are all sorts of causes for it. It includes money, but actually, I think, dispersal of the talent, the fact there's no central body, all sorts of things which are both structural and the result of the operation system over time with inadequate funding. Now, my question to you is, I sympathise with what you said about government departments taking some of the load. It does not seem to me that it is the function of the research councils to substitute for regular departmental funding of directly related research that's directly related to the function of the department. Having said that, it seems to me that there is likely to be in the digital age an ongoing need for quite advanced research involving the universities. Therefore, there is actually an ongoing role, certainly for the foreseeable future, for something that the sort of thing that UKRI does do. My question to you is, how would you see a mixed ecology evolving? What would you like? What sort of pattern would you like to see emerge for supporting the underlying research in this, I think, important field?
I think a mixed ecology is right. I think I would like to see the Home Office and the MOJ making sure that they are investing in the important science that they need to make their relative bits of the justice system work properly, and that is about the practical application and implementation of that science. And I would want that joined up with what we are doing, but also what local criminal justice systems are doing on the ground with local universities, where I have to say I think some of the most exciting things that are happening are in basically local ecologies. And I think the answer has to be a balance between the two. Therefore, I think I'm probably arguing for more money for government as well as more money for UKRI here to keep the balance in the right, to keep the balance right. Because I think if you try and fund it all through the research councils and innovate, then there is a risk that you lose relevance and practical application of what you're trying to do. So you sometimes need to fund it through both routes, but make sure they're joined up properly.
I would suggest to you, it's my view is a perfectly sensible answer, if I might say so. Well, I would suggest to you that you should look at how it's done in Northern Ireland and Scotland. There's an English problem, I think.
I think, and that goes back to the point about whether it's better to try and do this locally rather than nationally. I think there's a number of things that Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales do slightly better.
And how it's structured.
Yeah.
Okay. Lord Oxborough.
Yeah. How big is your constituency in this area of specialism? Because really there's a question. This is a question of what your council does of looking after what you might the rare fish here. And the size these take you a way that you should look after this is determined by the size of the group that you have. Because if there aren't that many, the solution is almost certainly different from other significantly larger communities. Would you like to talk about that?
I think that's a very difficult question, because it's where do you draw the boundaries between, how do you decide who's working on something that's relevant to forensic science and who isn't? And it's quite difficult to say. There's probably relatively few people who just define themselves purely as a forensic scientist in the sort of research world, as it were. But a lot of people who are working on research which has got some implications for forensic science. And yeah, I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer, but that's I think is the size of it, as it were.
Okay. Do you have any view on how many people there are in the question earning a living as forensic scientists?
Sorry, I don't precisely know that answer to that question. And then there's a question about who's actually a practicing forensic scientist working for the criminal justice system, and then there's who's actually working in the research world is slightly different. I don't know how many are forensic scientists working in various private sector companies.
Okay. We'll leave it.
Okay. Lord Thomas.
Question I wanted to ask you, to try and bring it within some bounds, I wanted to put 1 or 2 points to you first. I think it's clear that there are areas of forensic science where there's no scientific foundation. We've discussed one already, fingerprints. Gunshot residue is another. There are quite a number.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
I'm not a complete expert, but I suspect that you might be right.
And it's clear that forensic science must be, or science must be able to help improve areas of investigation for the future, particularly the use of artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And it's clear that since the US National Academy of Science reported on this in 2009, that this problem of underpinning science and research is a problem that's been known about for some years.
Correct.
And what I wholly fail to understand is if one looks at all the stuff, and I'm sorry to use the vernacular, but there's an awful lot of waffle and very little hard signs of developing a strategy, showing these are the areas, we need to do something about it. Who do you think ought to be doing this?
On your first point about the quality of the science, I think it's worth saying that some of the biggest problems, I think, is rigorous scientific method and statistical analysis is not always what it should be in a lot of these underlying bits of work. The second point I refer, and unfortunately it does sound like a bit of waffle, but I do refer to the previous point that I don't think one body by itself can develop a strategy for forensic science. We have to find some way of bringing all the relevant actors together to work out what the priorities are.
Yeah,
that must be critical.
But that is a body. If you bring everyone together, you create a body.
Yeah.
Now, who should do that? You or someone else? Who?
I think in order to give it some teeth, it probably should be commissioned by a government department.
And which department?
I think my guess is that the most relevant department is the Home Office. But there's massive implications for the Ministry of Justice as well in terms of being consumers of all the evidence.
So this detailed strategy, which I think everyone feels something ought to be done about, is a problem not for the Research Council but for those two ministries.
Yeah, but I would say that if there was a recommendation and a plan to develop a proper forensic science research strategy, we would be very willing to help and be active contributors to development of that strategy because we think it's very important.
And how long will this take? Bearing in mind it's gone on for years, and bearing in mind that people go to prison or are wrongly convicted if the scientific evidence isn't right.
I think I would be a bit slightly... I would point out that we're going to do a spending review next year. So the spending review will be very important in setting long-term direction spending on science and research across all government departments and within UK research and innovation. So I imagine that over the next year would be a very good time to do such a strategy.
Do you think that would be the most important way of getting forward movement on this subject? Or if not, what other would you suggest?
I think it's your best chance to get forward movement on this at this very moment. I think if you ask us to set it as a strategic priority, then I suspect the same thing might happen again. Whereas if we get a commitment to get all the parties to work together to produce something which we can all buy in and reports back to you on a regular basis, that might have some traction.
Thank you very much.
What happens if the Home Office asks you to do it?
I think I would suggest that the Home Office might want to consider appointing an independent chair to do something of this nature, because that is the best way to make it work.
Okay.
As I've seen in other spheres, as I've seen in other spheres of this area.
Baroness Young?
I wondered whether there have been conversations and discussions with the two science advisors in the Home Office and MOJ about this issue, and is this something that has exercised their minds? And
I have had discussions. I've had discussions with John Aston, who's the CSA in the Home Office, relatively recent. But I must admit I haven't gone into as much detail as you've just subjected me to. But I will promptly do so after this meeting.
I think you may find that Sir Mark can help you. I think you'll find that Sir Mark and the Chief Scientific Advisor of the Home Office for some years had been trying to get this subject moving.
I can imagine.
Baroness Young, you finished? Lord Thomas, did you have any other questions? Well, thank you very much,
Thank you
Dr.
very
Andy.
much.
Thank you for coming to help. I'm sorry that at times we've been a bit too forensic with you. But,
I'm sorry, I've got a bit of a bad cold, and I hope.
But thank you for coming
too
to help
groggy.
us. We much appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.